Well, thank you very much. It truly is my pleasure to be here tonight. I'm a native of Connecticut, and I'm well aware of the great work that the World Affairs Council of Connecticut does. But as President Emeritus of the World Affairs Councils of America, I'm also deeply indebted to your leadership and what they've done to help make the national network even stronger and better. Jay Bruns has been a member of the board with me for a very long time now. And I have to agree with Ed Stockton that you did find the gem under your nose, Megan Torrey. So it's a real privilege to be here tonight, and it's especially a privilege to be here with Ambassador Ford. As you know, Ambassador Ford retired from 30 years of a very distinguished career in the Foreign Service in February of this year. And the position that he retired from was our ambassador to Syria. What I'd really like to highlight about that is the time frame that he was there and why we're so lucky to have him here and why as a country we're so lucky to have him still advising on the Syrian issue. He actually went to Syria after the Arab Spring had started in Tunisia and Egypt, but before it had started in Syria, and he just left this February. And so he was there at the beginning and through the transition as it went from civil protests to a major conflagration and conflict with global potential to explode even further. And he also, for his service there, won the Profiles in Courage Award from the John F. Kennedy Profiles in Courage Award, which I think you will join me in congratulating him on that for his service. As a professor at the Naval Academy, I consider it one of my missions to make sure that our young officers in training understand and appreciate the role that our Foreign Service plays in our diplomacy and in serving our country. And Ambassador Ford really stands as an outsized model of that. In several points in his career, he has actually been threatened with violence and force for his views, including in Syria, which I hope he'll share with us, where he's known globally as a very, very strong opponent of the violence of the Assad regime and proponent of the opposition to that regime. He served in Algeria. He's a Middle Eastern expert. He speaks several languages, including Arabic, and you can read even more of his background, which includes time in Iraq, building up civic society there as deputy ambassador. So it's a real honor to be with you tonight, Ambassador Ford.
Thank you very much. It's a delight to be in Connecticut, and let me thank Jay and Megan for the kind invitation. It's my pleasure.
So in order to help us out in terms of understanding a sense of the audience, yesterday, an unnamed top senior national security official in the U.S. government said that Syria was the top national security issue facing us today. And so we thought we'd ask you just to raise your hand if you agree that Syria is the top national security issue facing us today. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, how about if I rephrase that question? Do you think Syria is a top national security issue compared to the missing Malaysian airliner? Okay, here we go. I still didn't get a whole room yet. Oh my goodness. So anyway, well, let's get going on this conversation. This is such a privilege. I'd like to start with the humanitarian crisis in Syria, and congratulations to AmeriCares and the fabulous work you do, and congratulations to you, Michael, for your leadership. The UN Special High Commissioner for Refugees recently was quoted as saying, and this is a really stunning quote, that the greatest tragedy facing us today, and probably in this century, is the humanitarian crisis in Syria. And he said that the suffering and the displacement that's happening in Syria right now is probably the worst in recent history, and again, the worst in this century. And so, Ambassador Ford, I'd like to ask you, What is the problem? Is it, we have AmeriCare spending $3.5 million in terms of getting medical supplies over. Are the supplies not there? Are the countries not donating? Is the problem not getting what's available to the people in need? 6 to 9 million people displaced out of a country of 22 million, 2.7 registered refugees. I'd just like to ask you what your assessment is of why this humanitarian crisis at this time when human security is such a critical issue on the international agenda, why we're facing such a severe crisis.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Lori. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon recently said that what's happening in Syria is the worst humanitarian crisis since the genocide in Rwanda 20 years ago. And I think to begin with, it's the scale of the problem. Syria, as recently as 3 years ago, was a successful, reasonably prosperous country of 23 million. Now more than 9 million, that is to say more than a third of the population, has been displaced from their homes. And the reason is simple. There's a horrible war going on. And in particular, the Syrian regime has been very punishing, very, very brutal in its treatment of neighborhoods, of communities where opposition fighters are located. Michael just mentioned the need to ship in nerve agents or nerve gas antidotes. How many regimes in the last 15, even 20 years have used sarin gas on their own populations? Even Saddam Hussein, and I served 5 years in Iraq, Saddam Hussein never used chemical weapons on this scale. Now they're dropping chlorine bombs on people. So that's part of it, the brutality of the regime, which is basically trying to depopulate areas. What that in turn is doing as people flee their homes to get away from the regime's violence, they're either piling into communities that are safer inside Syria or they're going out of Syria into the neighboring countries and causing, in particular, problems in countries that are friendly to us, such as Jordan and Lebanon and Turkey.
And how serious is that destabilization on the humanitarian side with the refugees? That Lebanon's a very small country, 4 million, and facing about 1 million refugees.
Right. Lebanon, actually now about a quarter of the population inside the borders of Lebanon are Syrian refugees. So imagine if the United States had 85 million refugees. That's basically what Lebanon is confronting, with nothing like the resources that a country like the United States has. Jordan, King Abdullah, is very alarmed, and he's a very good friend of the United States, but he's very alarmed at the strain that approximately 1.2 million Syrian refugees in Jordan are putting on housing, on jobs, because now Jordanians are competing with desperate Syrian refugees for jobs. Jordan has a terrible water shortage. Its population has just surged by 1 million people approximately. Where will they get the water resources for that? And so in countries like Lebanon and countries like Jordan, it is particularly difficult.
And I should mention too, in terms of AmeriCares, is not only contributing the aid that they're contributing in terms of medical supplies, and about 60% of the hospitals have been destroyed in Syria, but is also a partner on the With Syria effort in terms of the NGOs coming together and trying to raise the profile and the level of support for the humanitarian crisis taking place there. And so going to the conflict itself and President Assad, you were there at the beginning. Before in January, January, the protests started in March of 2011. And President Assad was looking at President Ben Ali in Tunisia, who protests started, he was gone within a month. He watched President Mubarak. Protests started in Egypt, he was gone within 18 days. President Assad stayed, and then, as you were saying, he fought back and has been fighting back now very brutally. What insights can you give us in terms of what you think his decision-making was on how he was going to handle this crisis? Do you think he went into it saying, I'm going to stick to this? What did he think his strengths were that he could withstand the pressure, whereas the other two presidents who were authoritarian dictators as well, one worse than the other, but still, ruled with iron hands?
I think Assad was very surprised by what has happened. I don't think he expected it. I met him just days before Hosni Mubarak in Egypt resigned. And of course I asked him, Mr. President, didn't turn out so well in Tunisia, and dictatorship there and dictatorship in Egypt, that didn't turn out real well. How are you feeling about Syria these days, Mr. President? I did it in a way like Leslie was describing, which is to say I said it in a long period without saying very much, but Assad got the message. And he said, it's not going to happen here, don't bet on it. And literally weeks after that, it started. And I think Assad himself, frankly, does not understand why Syrians were so angry at his regime. The demand that we heard constantly from opposition figures back in 2011 was people want to be treated with dignity. They were tired of corruption, having to pay for a driver's license. And when I say pay, I mean not the scheduled fee, but like 10 times the scheduled fee. To pay for a business license. And I don't mean the scheduled fee for a business license. I mean like 10 times the scheduled fee for a business license. Or having to pay to have the teacher do the grades for your child in high school so that they could apply to college. The corruption drove them crazy. The brutality of the regime infuriated them. Police brutality was on an epic scale in Syria. And I don't think Assad understood any of that. He lives in something of a bubble, frankly.
That's very interesting, especially since he was if you were looking at the three leaders, he was the least likely having, in terms of projecting brutality, since he had actually not anticipated really ever leading his country.
Well, he studied ophthalmology in Great Britain. He's an eye doctor. And his wife is a Syrian British woman who used to work actually for Citibank in London. And so they project an image of being very sophisticated. But when I was preparing to go to Syria and I was trying to read in about what was going on there and how it worked, I asked my boss at the State Department, the Assistant Secretary, I said, well, what books would you recommend? And he waved me off and he said, oh, you don't need to read a book. Just watch The Sopranos for a couple of episodes and you'll get a real good understanding of how it works there.
Well, in terms of, it was interesting in this February, DNI, the Director of National Intelligence, Jim Clapper, actually testified to the Senate that a major turning point, so Assad was basically going on a decline in terms of the opposition and the conflict. And he highlighted President Obama's effort, first after, he highlighted the effort of the Chemical Weapons Convention as being a turning point in terms of having an impact on having him become much stronger and his regime becoming much more legitimate. Would you agree with that? And do you think that effort, how do you see the whole play out of the Red Line and then the effort on the Chemical Weapons Convention in terms of how it affected the conflict?
Well, I think when the president said it was a red line and the regime then very clearly used sarin gas on a massive scale in 4 different neighborhoods around Damascus on August 21st, I think everyone in the region and frankly many countries around the world, Francois Hollande, the president of France, for example, expected the United States to lead an international military effort to at least use military force to deter the regime from using chemical weapons again. And when the president decided to use diplomacy and have John Kerry negotiate something with Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov in Geneva, and I was there for those discussions, I think there was a real shock. And countries in the region, in particular our friends like Turkey and Saudi Arabia, were bitterly disappointed that the American Air Force didn't appear suddenly. But from our perspective, we were able to rid Syria of about 90% of the chemical agents and of most of the production facilities, so that it was a real achievement, but it's an incomplete achievement. The regime still controls some production facilities. They're not supposed to, but they do. And now they are using chlorine gas. And did anyone see what the Syrian ambassador to the United Nations said about chlorine gas the week before last in the United Nations? He said chlorine is not dangerous. Chlorine is what you disinfect swimming pools and bleach your laundry with, as if countries like Britain, France, the United States have no experience with chlorine gas in combat situations. It really was a shocking remark.
And chlorine gas is what was used in World War I that actually led to the ban on chemical weapons globally, the norm, and then years later led to the actual Chemical Weapons Convention with the verification provisions that were included with that.
Right.
So now on the opposition side, and I know, the American public, myself, if you could help lend some insights into understanding the opposition, the factions. I mean, we're dealing with, we constantly hear about Al-Qaeda factions, and then Al-Qaeda has a meeting and they decided that they're only in favor of one faction and not the other. If you could break down what's happening with the opposition and then lend some insights, since this was the effort you were very much engaged in terms of how do we decide as a country, how did we make the determinations about which opposition factions to support?
Mm-hmm. There are a lot of factions, and you really do sort of need a scorecard, not so different if you're, I'm in Red Sox Nation territory up here, and I'm a Baltimore Orioles fan, but I actually think if you're trying to follow the entire American League, you don't need to know every player on the 25-man starting teams for each team. What you do need to know are the different teams. It's divided, Lori, but it's not that divided. There are just several large clumps of opposition figures. The one that is the problem is the Al-Qaeda faction, which is important in the opposition. It's big. It probably represents, I'm going to roughly estimate, 25% of the fighters, people who are carrying guns and using them against Bashar al-Assad. The other 75% actually are fighting a two-front war now. They're fighting against Al-Qaeda, which is good for us, and they're also fighting against Bashar al-Assad, back to what I said about dignity and getting rid of a brutal regime, etc. They're fighting a two-front war, and we have been working to get more support into those people who are fighting both Al-Qaeda and the regime.
And we just gave diplomatic recognition to the Syrian opposition this week.
Mm-hmm. Not full diplomatic recognition. A lot of this is a game of inches. Now I'm mixing to football metaphors, but we have gone up a notch in terms of the manner in which we will work with, if you want to call it this, a bigger coalition of opposition factions together, sort of the American League of the Syrian opposition.
And so
they do need a designated hitter rule, though.
And they have come, they came to the United States this week. They met in Washington yesterday. Mm-hmm. And we are giving them the TOW anti-tank missiles. And they've come asking for the anti-aircraft missiles, more lethal aid, particularly to be able to shoot down aircraft. Major concern to us that we don't want to be disseminating that type of technology, particularly in this type of conflict. Do you think we should be doing more? And one of the major criticisms in Washington, Senator McCain, I worked on the McCain campaign, there was just a slip. Senator McCain's biggest criticism of the Obama administration, it was too little, too late. Should we be doing more now? And do you think part of the reason why this conflict has spun out of control in terms of growing from an internal conflict to a regional and potentially global conflict is because we did too little, too late? And should we be doing more?
I think we have to do more. Not many people raised their hands when they said Syria was the most important problem we have in the world right now. The head of the FBI, the head of the Directorate of National Intelligence, Jim Clapper, and the Secretary of Homeland Security, all in the last 3 months, have told Congress that the problem of fighters going into Syria and joining al-Qaeda to fight against the Assad regime and then using American or British or some other European passport to come back into this country and to carry out terrorist acts is one of their major preoccupations now. That is to say, there is a growing concern in Washington that the Syrian conflict is actually going to reach out and touch us directly in this country at some point. And so we do have an interest in, A, fighting al-Qaeda on the ground there. Does that mean we have to send in American forces? No. I think indigenous forces, local forces, who already are fighting al-Qaeda, we should be helping them. And I mentioned that there are groups that are actually doing this now. And they're actually having success on the ground. They have kicked al-Qaeda out of a number of cities and provinces in Syria and sort of are starting to squeeze them and contain them. That needs to continue. But that doesn't solve the conflict. That could go on a long time, and you always have the risk of spillage or drainage or infiltration from groups there. Problem of Afghanistan before 9/11 all over again. And that is a major risk in Syria. So we still need to end the conflict in some way. And that, because of the stalemate on the ground between the opposition and Bashar, because of that stalemate, we'll have to get to a negotiation. We tried very hard to launch a negotiation during the winter in January and February.
And
Secretary Kerry led that effort. I was there.
You were key in putting that together.
It was stillborn. The regime, Bashar al-Assad, said he absolutely would not discuss any changes in government, would not discuss it. And so the talks immediately broke down. I think we will still have to try to get the regime to go to the table and negotiate. It's not for the United States to negotiate it. This is not our country. It's not ultimately our problem. But it could reach us. It could touch us. And so we need to get the negotiations going, and we need them eventually between Syrians to succeed. And if it takes more pressure on Assad on the ground to get him to agree to go to the table, then we will have to increase that pressure.
And another pressure point is obviously Russia. And here again, the decision in terms of the chemical weapons and the Chemical Weapons Convention was not only seen as legitimizing Assad, but it was also the first time that President Putin was back on the global scene, playing a major role when we've seen where that's taken us as he's continued on that path. How do you think, what are the key elements in terms of trying to convince Russia that it's in their interest to help resolve this through a negotiation?
Yeah. I think Syria is Russia's last friend in the Middle East. During, a period of 40 years, Russia, and before it the Soviet Union, had a variety of friends in the Middle East that included Libya, that included Syria, that included Iraq, that included Yemen. And all of those friends now are gone, except Bashar al-Assad and Syria. They're the last ones. And I think Putin does not want to see his friend, or at least the friendly government in Syria, removed for something new that he doesn't know what it's going to be. Where we have talked to the Russians, and I've been in innumerable conversations with Secretary Kerry and Foreign Minister Lavrov, is both we and the Russians have a combined interest in seeing that al-Qaeda presence, those 7, 10, 12,000 extremist fighters, see them contained and eventually eliminated. Al-Qaeda-related fighters conducted numerous terrorist acts inside Russia. They blew up the Russian metro. They made a mess in places like Grozny. They killed thousands of people. The Russians don't want to go through that again. And there are plenty of Al-Qaeda-related fighters from the Caucasus area of Russia, the Chechens, who are in Syria right now. And they're very visible. You can YouTube tonight when you go home. Chechen fighters, YouTube, you'll see them. The Russians are afraid of those people and they want them eliminated. We do too. We also are threatened by people like that. So the question is, can we and the Russians find a way to achieve a mutual security need by finding a solution, a negotiated solution to the Syrian conflict? Very frankly, Lori, we failed to do that in Geneva. The Russians were unwilling to put enough pressure on Bashar al-Assad to get him to negotiate a new political system, a new political government.
So what do you think the Ukraine effect is? Does it make that worse in terms of Putin's steadfastness, or does it actually help?
Yeah, they asked me that yesterday on WNPR, same question. The Syria crisis predates Ukraine by several years. When it started in 2011, we weren't talking about this kind of a problem in Ukraine. In 2012 and in 2013. The Syria crisis now is well into its 4th year. And so all I can say is I view Ukraine as more a reflection of what happened in Syria, which is to say that when the White House, when the president promised stern measures against the Russians if it continued, I cannot help but think that Vladimir Putin recalled the red line threat from the president in August and said, well, how tough can they really be? I think Ukraine is a different situation from Syria, and the American reaction to what's going to happen or what is happening in Ukraine will necessarily be different from what it is in Syria. There are different interests, there are different players involved. But I suspect that Vladimir Putin is not impressed so far with the amount of pressure we have put on Russia and Bashar al-Assad, and therefore he is not so afraid in Ukraine. Although today there are some positive signs for the first time, touch wood.
Yeah. And in terms of other winners in this conflict, if there could be other winners, Iran and Iran's hegemonic role in the region, that seems to be strengthening due to this conflict.
Yes.
And puts them in a pivotal position as well in terms of finding a solution.
Even perhaps more than the Russians, Iran is giving huge help to Bashar al-Assad. They've organized fighters to go in. You know, Assad's control of the population is only about 15% of the population. Roughly 70% of the population is against Assad. And so he has a real manpower shortage in a war of attrition. You usually wouldn't bet on a small minority to win a war of attrition. So the Iranians have been sending in fighters. People that we were fighting against in Baghdad in 2006, 7, and 8, 9. Iraqi Shia mobilized with Iran, fighting against our soldiers in places like Baghdad and Basra. Those same Iraqi fighters, organized by Iran, are now in Syria fighting for Bashar al-Assad. Hezbollah, who we know very well, they've killed Americans on things like the hijacked TWA flight in the late 1980s. And of course, they have fought several wars against Israel. Hezbollah has gone into Syria in a very big way, thousands of soldiers. And the Iranians have actually sent their own uniformed personnel to go fight in the war as well. They are the only country that has sent uniformed personnel formally to go fight in Syria. And they are strengthening their position. They're strengthening their influence in Damascus. And if they prevail, they will represent a bigger threat, not only to us, but also, frankly, to Israel and to our other friends in the region, including the Lebanese government, the Jordanian government. And so it's a big concern. This is why Saudi Arabia and Turkey are fighting so hard back against Iran.
And in terms of our relationship with Iran and the nuclear talks going on, there's been a very strong effort on the part of the United States to actually keep the nuclear talks about the nuclear talks. Do you think that's the right strategy?
I'm a realist. Iran has people on the ground fighting, and they're sending in money, they're sending in weapons, and I don't think we can get a deal in Syria without Iran. And so at some point, sooner is probably better than later, we will have to open some kind of a channel with Iran to figure out, just as we've tried to do with Russia, are there some kind of a common set of interests that we could all agree on as the basis for a solution to this grinding Syrian conflict?
So we've talked about Russia, we've talked about, and its relationship with Syria, we've talked about the Shia-Sunni issue and Iran's role, and now the Sunni-Sunni issue, where Saudi Arabia and the UAE are actually at loggerheads with the Qataris on which factions to support. It seems like whatever layer you go to here, there's a complexity.
Yeah. I used to think nothing could be more complicated than Iraq when I was over there, but Syria wins hands down. In the end, if you boil it down to its essence, Lori, there has been for the last 1,500 years a bitter conflict between the two halves of the Islamic world, the Sunni based out of Saudi Arabia basically, and Shia based basically out of Persia, Iran. That long fight boiled over, we saw it in Iraq. The American military was in the middle of it. Now it is in Syria, and it has both a civil war aspect in Syria, Shia Alawis fighting Sunnis, but then backed up by partners, Saudi Arabia and Turkey for the Sunnis inside Syria, Iran and Hezbollah and Iraqi Shia to help the regime. And so Syria has gone from a peaceful protest movement, and I actually witnessed peaceful protests. I actually went and talked to protesters and urged that they avoid violence. That became harder and harder for them as the regime became more and more brutal, more arrests, more extrajudicial killings. Then it devolved into a civil war, and now still is a civil war, but has taken on an angle of a regional war. And so to put that all back in a box, I think we have to address the regional angle. We must discuss with Iran, with Saudi Arabia, with Turkey, with Russia, what would be the basis for finding a solution, and at the same time deal with the civil war, which means getting Syrians to talk to other Syrians. And it's a devilishly tricky operation.
And so projection on timeline in terms of endgame?
I have none. I've been speaking to groups. I was in California last week, and I'm not prepared to be any more optimistic now, a week after I spoke in California last week. This will grind on for a while. It means that there are going to be more refugees. It means that there are going to be more pleas from the United Nations for the United States to provide more help. The United Nations for refugees thinks it needs $6.5 billion with a B dollars this year, calendar year 2014. So far, they have received only $1.5 billion. So they are getting only about a quarter of what they need. And they're going to be coming back to us and saying, if you don't want to watch on TV starving children, you, the Americans, you, the Europeans, you, Arab countries, are going to have to pay a lot more money. So that's one problem. And then the second is this incipient terror threat that the FBI, that Homeland Security, that the Director of National Intelligence is talking about. And so we do have an interest in finding a way forward to solve this, but I cannot say it's going to be fast, and I certainly cannot say it's going to be easy.
So last question to all of you. At the end of this discussion, how many of you think Syria is a top national security issue facing us? Well, join me in thanking Ambassador Ford. That was really very... Thank you so much. What an incredible opportunity.
Thanks, Fran.
Just stay on the stage for Megan wants to come up. Okay.
Thank you. That was really excellent. I
That was a
really appreciate it.
fascinating conversation. And Mr. Ambassador, I really want to salute you for not only your service to our country, but your courage in
Thanks.
doing that.
Sometimes it wasn't courage, it was just foolishness.
That's the better part of courage.
So we couldn't let you leave Harvard without giving you a few reminders of us. So courtesy of the Harvard Business Journal, we have some Harvard books for you.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And then
Excellent.
we have some World Affairs Council mementos. And knowing that you are from Baltimore, in walking distance of Camden Yards, I have a very nice gift for you.
I do not think the Orioles Nation will recognize diplomatic immunity if I wear that to Camden Yards. Thank you very much, Reagan.
Thank you, Megan.